of all, thank you very much for having me today. I'm pleased to be here and really excited to represent another perspective on autism research. We've heard so many fantastic presentations today from the people who actually do the research to families, mothers who have direct experience with this. So I've really enjoyed my Sunday with all of you. And I hope I can contribute to that perspective by telling you a little bit about what not just NIH or NIMH does, but what the federal government does to support research on autism. So I thought I would start today by giving a bit of an overview about NIH, just for those of you who are not as familiar. So I'll talk about NIH and how we set some priorities and give you some specific updates on some of the initiatives that are ongoing. So in a way, you've heard a lot about the science that has already happened, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the projects that are in process and that potentially will yield the next set of finding in the following years. So NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, has a very broad mission. We fund the wide range of mental disorders. So we include a focus on autism, but we focus on the full range of disorders: depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, a lot of the other disorders you've heard about today. Our mission is also very broadly focused on supporting research that spans very basic research, foundational science we need to develop future cures and interventions. But we also fund the translational research you've heard about today, as well as the testing and development of interventions and services for people with mental disorders. We support more than 3,000 research grants. Those go out mostly to people at universities. And we also have an intramural research program within the NIH that supports about 600 investigators and staff. The way that we typically support research is through investigator-initiated research, which means investigators come to us with their ideas and say, this is what I want to do. It gets reviewed by a group of their peers, and then the institute, depending on how well the review went, decides to fund or not to fund. Another major role of NIMH and the other NIH institutes is actually to identify gaps in the field and set priorities. So we develop what we call funding opportunity announcements, which is a call for investigators to come to us with specific projects. So when I talk about our priorities, we highlight what we're asking the field to do to fill in the gaps. So Joe mentioned that NIMH has a strategic plan for research, and this is essentially our roadmap for setting our priorities, how we use federal dollars to support research. So about every 5 years, we update our strategic plan. The last update was in 2015. Every year, we do update strategic research priorities, which fall within each of these 4 major objectives. We get a little bit more specific about the kinds of things we're focusing on. So as you can tell from these objectives, they're very broad. The basic research kind of represented in Objective 1, that includes things like understanding the genetics of our disorders and the biological pathways. Number 2, understanding the natural history and development of these disorders, mainly to understand when are the ideal points of intervention. And 3 and 4 focus very much on developing interventions and figuring out how best to implement those in the community. Our NIMH is actually organized around our strategic plan and around the idea of translating basic research all the way into the community. So we're designed in a way to move the translational continuum along. We are not the ones who actually implement the interventions that we have funded the development of, but we pull those out and push those out into our sister partners and federal agencies, for example, to implement these. So SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, is one example of a federal agency that can take evidence-based treatments and put them out into the community. I just want to highlight, too, that we have a number of cross-cutting offices that cut across basic translational and intervention science, and those focus on things like disparities and global mental health and genomics and technology development, just to give you some examples. Always like to highlight when I give talks around development, the critical importance of neurodevelopment and the development of the phases of the disease. NIMH is very invested in not just understanding autism or depression or bipolar in its disease state, but we really want to understand the very early origins, hopefully before symptomatic signs or symptoms are outwardly noticeable. And the goal is, if we can do that, we are going to do a much better job of mitigating the long-term effects of these disorders over time. So this really just highlights the importance of doing that, and the importance that even normative maturation is a key part of understanding the disease trajectory. So we really need to understand what is normal and what goes awry in our various disorders. As many of you may know, over the last, almost a year ago, we got a new NIMH director. His name is Joshua Gordon. He regrets that he couldn't be here today. But with a new director, obviously, comes new priorities. So I thought I'd take just the next couple of minutes talking about some of the things Dr. Gordon has talked about in his first almost year here. Just to give you his background very briefly, he is a neuroscientist by training, but he's also a psychiatrist who, up until his transition to NIMH, maintained a practice. So he's very invested in linking the basic research with really making a difference in the lives of patients and families. So for any of you who might read his director's messages, he's talked a lot about what NIMH science should look like, and his first and foremost priority is to focus on excellent science, which we like to believe we have been doing already. But he really wants our funding decisions to be based on things that you might expect: rigor, good design, potential impact. But the idea is, with federal dollars stretched, or dollars from any one foundation stretched as well, we really need to focus on studies that are more definitive, studies that will change the field or practice, i.e. have great impact, and other studies that really shake things up and get us thinking in new directions. He also highlights the importance of the idea that excellent science really comes from diversity, and it's diversity in subject matter or approaches, diversity in the people who do the research and the participants who take part in the research, and diversity in timeframes. So let me just give you a sense of what I mean by timeframes. As you might imagine, there are lots of interests in how we divide up the NIMH portfolio and what the right balance should actually be. And Dr. Gordon talks about this in terms of short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. So we have patients and families who are suffering right now. So we need to very much focus on research that can identify implementable evidence-based practices now. So we have a portion of our portfolio dedicated to doing just that. The medium term are about developing technologies or developing translational research that won't have immediate payback, but eventually will, in a shorter term than the long-term goals. But the long-term goals are those investments, probably more on the basic science side, that while they are possibly 10 to 20 years from anything considered implementable, are absolutely key to developing the novel treatments or interventions for the future. So we have to consider this full range of needs and the full range of what we need to do for the science. I'm just going to highlight the middle goal. With each of these goals, the short, medium, and long-term goals, Dr. Gordon's given some examples of the kinds of areas he would like to focus. It's very apropos that this month is Suicide Awareness Month. And so this was highlighted when Dr. Gordon first came as being one of his main clinical areas of foci would be on suicide prevention. And maybe another time I can talk to you about all the things we're doing in that space. The midterm goal, neurocircuits, is really something that Dr. Gordon has a very strong background in, and his interest here is in really being able to more clearly link brain circuitry to the behaviors that we see in our disorders, with the idea that this will get us to the development of novel treatments for the future, and hopefully treatments that are much more precision medicine based, that a lot of our speakers have already talked about, and more effective in those particular patients. And the long-term goal, just one example, is interest in computational psychiatry. In the most simplest form, you can think of this as very large or big data approaches to finding patterns and associations in large data approaches. Just an example of one area of the neurocircuitry idea that's most relevant to autism. I mentioned that one of the things that NIMH does, as all of the NIH centers, is to identify gap areas. So neurodevelopment of circuits has become very clear that it's something we've been working on for some time, but it's a big gap area, and it's particularly relevant to autism and other neurodevelopmental disorders. So just highlighting that here. And despite these gap areas, I do want to assure you that we've been working very hard, and there has been tremendous progress already in what we know about the development of the brain and the development of circuitry over time. This is just one example. I like to highlight some examples here and there, and this is from Sean Dione, who is an NIH Brains awardee. NIMH Brains Award is a new investigator mechanism for funding people who are up and coming, very promising future leaders in the field. So Dr. Dione was the first class of NIMH Brains awardees, and he here presents the very first known in vivo visualization of the development of white matter tracks in the brain. So before, you couldn't actually see this in living individuals, and now he found an imaging technique to do that. So we're making progress. So the second thing I thought I would do this morning is give you an update on the Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee. Not sure how many people, I think I recognize some people who may have attended these meetings in the past. The Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee is a federal advisory committee. It was established in 2000, and it was first established by Congress, and it has been reauthorized 2 times, the latest in 2014. It's an advisory committee that includes 12 federal department members and 14 public members. You can see that NIH plays a large role. NIMH coordinates the effort, and we have sister institutes who participate as well. This falls under the Department of Health and Human Services, and the idea is really to coordinate efforts across the Department of Health and Human Services. So you can imagine we have a lot of institutes, we have a lot of sister agencies, everyone doing their own bit of research on autism, funding to investigators. So this is one means that we get together and actually report on what everyone's doing and make plans for the future. One of the activities of the IACC is to develop an autism strategic plan. The goals are based on key questions that are important to our stakeholders. So these are not just pie in the sky sort of ideas of what could we do. They're really based on the needs in the community. The purpose of this strategic plan is to focus, coordinate, and accelerate high-quality scientific research and service provision activities in partnership across our stakeholders, and that does include federal and private stakeholders. The IACC just met last month, and the latest version of their strategic plan should be posted by October. So you can see what that looks like. But I'm going to give you a brief overview of that in the next 2 slides. It addresses 7 questions in total, and it gives you a sense of what each of those are. So screening and diagnoses is one important area. Parents are asking, well, how can I recognize this in my young children? Why is early detection so important? Understanding biology is the second question. That includes the genetics that we heard about this morning, identifying risk factors for autism, developing treatments and interventions, developing services that actually maximize the quality of life for people on the spectrum. And then a big issue that the IACC has discussed this year are lifespan issues. How can we actually meet the needs of individuals on the spectrum as they progress through adulthood? We've done a pretty good job of understanding the needs of those first diagnosed and through the elementary years, but we have not done a very good job of knowing the needs of individuals through adolescence and particularly into adulthood. And question 7 focuses on infrastructure for meeting the needs of the entire community. Okay, so what's NIH doing for autism research? So I thought I would spend a little time now talking about some of our ongoing initiatives, and some of them you've actually heard about this morning. First, I wanted to give you a sense that the federal government is actually the largest funder of ASD research in the United States. This was data that came out of the IACC from 2015. The total funding that year was about $340 million, and the federal government provides about 81% of that support, and 20% comes from private foundations. You can see from this slide that there has been a doubling of investment in autism research from 2008 to 2016. And what you don't see is this slide is there was actually a quadrupling since 2001. So since 2001, we spend 4 times as much. This is across NIH on autism research. Those nice little pink bumps in 2009 and 10 were thanks to the era when we received extra funding from the federal government to do some special projects in those 2 years. I mentioned, while I'm here from NIMH, I mentioned that there are a wide number of NIH institutes that do fund autism research, and I thought it was worthwhile just to mention a few of those. There are 3 institutes, NIDCD, NIEHS, and NINDS, which have a much more focused interest in autism research. So NIDCD is the Deafness and Communication Disorders Institute, and not surprising, they're very interested in funding autism research focused on issues around communication and interventions to improve speech and language outcomes in individuals on the spectrum. NIEHS is our Environmental Health Institute, and they fund research on the environmental links or potential causes of autism. NINDS is the Neurological Disorders and Stroke Institute, and their emphasis is on rare genetic and syndromic disorders associated with ASD. So you've heard a lot about Phelan-McDermott syndrome, Fragile X, and Rett syndrome. They fund a lot of that research. NIMH, my institute, and NICHD, the Child Health and Human Development Institute, we focus much more broadly and really cover the range of funding associated with the causes of autism, with early screening, early detection, the underlying neurobiology, the course of ASD, and then treatment development and evaluation of services. So for those of you interested in research, this gives you a general idea of the institutes most relevant to the work that you do. And because this is a problem that spans many institutes, we do work very closely together to support a number of large institutes that probably any one institute alone would not be able to do. But I want to talk to you about those because these are sort of the top programs in autism funding within the federal government, particularly within NIH, and they've yielded tremendous impact already. So I thought I would take the time to do that. And the first one is the Autism Sequencing Consortium, which you've actually heard fair amount about already. So just to give you a general overview, this is a collaboration of more than 20 research groups that are applying cutting-edge genetic sequencing to large collections of data. You've already heard that CEVR is one of the leaders in this consortium, and the promise is that with additional funding for the next 5 years, they're going to be looking at up to 50,000 samples. And to be able to increase our understanding of the genetics of autism spectrum disorder. This is one of many findings. There are more than I could possibly talk about today, and you have heard a little bit of some of the findings from that work. But this is a seminal piece that really highlights, and we heard a little bit about this morning already. The assessment of cases have identified a large number of risk genes already, more than this by now, but also have identified 2 biological pathways that relate to these diseases. And this is critically important for the development of our future interventions in autism research. Another large-scale initiative is the Autism Biomarkers Consortium for clinical trials. And this is a public-private partnership between the government, nonprofit, and other private partners. This one is based at Yale University. It includes Duke, Boston Children's Hospital, the University of Washington, and UCLA. And the goal here is to create a set of measures that can be used in our clinical trials to determine which treatments are best for which patients. So this is precisely the precision medicine that people have been talking about a lot over the past few hours. We need to know who's going to benefit from which of the treatments, and these clinical trials are set up in a way to identify that. The Autism Centers of Excellence is one of our longest ongoing programs in ASD research. This was a program created in 2007. It's supported by a number of NIH institutes. And the goals here are to determine the causes and best treatments for autism spectrum disorders. This program supports both centers and networks, and really the difference here is just in terms of whether the investigators are located together in a geographical space or located across the country. But the idea is to bring groups of people together to study common questions. Groups of people who have shared interests study common questions over time. The exciting part is that the funded teams actually collect data using common data elements or common methods, common measures, and all of the data that come from this research, as well as almost all of the data that come from NIH-funded research, is actually deposited in the National Data of Autism Research Archive, so that those data are then cleared of subject identifiers and are available for other investigators to reanalyze the data in other ways or answer different questions. So it's not just, the data aren't limited to those investigators conducting the study, but are put into this database and then are shared broadly with the research community for future analyses. The ACE centers have produced a number of seminal findings as well. Here I'm just going to highlight some of the findings from the Infant Brain Imaging Study Network. Here, this slide highlights a study by Emerson and colleagues showing that brain function in infancy can be used to accurately predict high-risk infants, which high-risk infants will later receive an autism diagnosis. So the nice thing here is that before the symptoms are actually evident, we're seeing differences in brain function early in life to help us identify which kids are at highest risk. This uses brain imaging and a machine learning algorithm to actually identify these clusters and patterns. And the investigators were able to predict with greater than 96% accuracy whether a 6-month-old at risk will actually develop an autism diagnosis. So that's pretty phenomenal. Here's a similar study by another investigator in the same group, published in Nature. And this is another prospective neuroimaging study of 106 infants at high risk for ASD. And by high risk, I mean they have a family member, a sibling in this case, who have autism spectrum disorder. And between, for those, this slide, without going into the details, really highlights the brain changes that occur between 6 and 12 months and how those actually predict which individuals get a diagnosis of autism at between 12 and 24 months. And this very much focuses on brain pattern overgrowth. And again, it uses a similar machine learning technique, which basically means you put all of the data into a learning algorithm, and it, in this case, predicts with 81% accuracy. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit in this next phase. So we've talked a little bit about our investments in genomics and in precision medicine and biomarkers. Here, we're focused on sort of the other end of the continuum, which is services for individuals with autism, and whether these services work in community settings. So we have 3 related initiatives that fall under the ASD Services Research Across the Lifespan, or SERVE ASD initiative. And the first is focused on early identification and linkage to service. So this is for pretty young kids. And the other 2 are pilot studies focused on services for those transition age youth, those transitioning through adolescence and into adulthood, and another set of pilot studies focused on adults with ASD. So the SERVE ID comes directly out of the Autism Strategic Plan developed by the IACC, which I explained to you earlier. And it addresses the first question, when should I be concerned? So in response to this, NIMH put out a funding opportunity announcement asking for investigators to give us their best ideas, best research ideas for identifying individuals early in life and linking them to services. So we have funded 5 research studies, and this covers actually a dozen sites across the United States. And these studies include focus on detection of ASD by first birthday. That's the one by Karen Pierce. A screen refer test model, a early identification and linkage to services in urban settings, addressing health disparities, and one focused on mobilizing detection services systems. So in addition to their individual research aims or goals, we brought the group back together to talk about what more we could do by leveraging the 5 different sites, the 5 different investigators. So NIMH convened the group in 2014 to talk about this. And the researchers formed what they're calling the NIMH ASD Prevention Early Detection Engagement and Services Research Network, or ASD-PEDS. And they're expanding their efforts now to test a range of strategies for universal ASD screening and early referral to services, focusing specific on that 0 to 3 years of age, 0 to 3 years. They've agreed to use 4 common measures across their studies, and they plan to pool their data at the end to do their analyses together. So collectively, with the 5 studies and the 12 sites, they will screen over 70,000 children, of whom we expect about 1,000 of them to be on the spectrum. So this is very promising for the future. I'm going to actually skip over the next one and just highlight that these studies are really in their third of 5 years of development. So we're going to hear more about them maybe the next time someone from NIMH comes to talk to you. I also suggested that we were funding some pilot studies in the area of developmental milestones from adolescence to adulthood. This slide just highlights the very normative challenges of adolescence and early adulthood in a typically developing person, and so it kind of highlights what those areas might be for individuals on the spectrum as well. What do we actually know about the service needs for transition age youth and autism? So based on the literature, we know that among youth with ASD, 70% have a comorbid mental disorder that's going to warrant treatment. We know that they have poorer social engagement compared to youth even with other disabilities. We know that they have poor post-secondary employment and education outcomes, especially in the first 2 years after high school. And we know that 20% have been stopped and questioned by police, so we know they have some contact with the criminal justice system as well. What do we know about adults with ASD? Actually, very little. There's a real dearth of information, even in the literature, on the needs of adults with ASD. So these are areas in which we need to, NIMH has decided to spend more effort. So starting in 2009 through this current year, we have funded a number of studies that have focused on both transition age and adults with ASD. And we've divided them into the different areas to highlight the studies that kind of cover the spectrum. So we fund studies that focus on determining service needs in both age groups. We fund research on managing healthcare in both of these age groups. Social functioning, so far we've only had one awarded on the adult side. And in post-secondary education, one on the transition age youth side. For employment, we've actually got a pretty robust group of studies working on those questions right now, and the same for future planning. So this gives you a sense that while we don't know a whole lot right now, we should know a whole lot in the next few years. This slide is really just to highlight NIMH's interest in an experimental therapeutics approach to research. This is not necessarily specific to autism, but I think relevant to a lot of what we've talked about today. And what do I mean by that? This is sort of reiterating the idea of an experimental medicine approach a precision medicine approach in one way. But the emphasis here is when we focus on developing our next generation of interventions, we actually focus them on specific targets that we know are going awry, whether they're on the genetic end or the biological pathway or brain circuitry, that we develop these interventions to address the pathways that we've been identifying through research. And the idea is hopefully that will yield us not only greater clinical value in the long term, but also kind of give us a feedback loop for letting us know how should we be searching for additional biological pathways if they're not panning out into interventions. I thought I would take just a moment to mention the research domain criteria. This is a big emphasis at NIMH and has been for almost 10 years now. And here the idea is to not rely wholly on DSM, as someone mentioned, the Bible of psychiatry, but to really focus on domains of function that are probably closer to the biology so that we can do a better job of understanding the underlying causes of our disorders, including autism. So a colleague of mine put together this group of papers that are relevant. I think her point is you've really already been doing this in the autism area anyway. You've in some ways been deconstructing autism to focus on its component parts. We just heard a fantastic talk on sensory processing and sensory experiences as one example. And this is just to highlight, we've already been funding grants that take this sort of approach or this lens. Okay, so I just wanted to wind down now and just highlight some of our large resources that are available to all of you who are investigators, but also to patients and families who may be interested in contributing. I already briefly mentioned the National Database for Autism Research. This is now called the NIMH Data Archive, so we've actually expanded it beyond autism research. But the credit really goes to the autism community for helping us establish this. This was an idea that came out from a lot of our stakeholder conversations very early on through the IACC, focusing on the need that the community needed to bring together a lot of data to answer big questions. And this is precisely what the National Data Archive is supposed to do. And I already alluded to this. All data funded by the NIH on autism research goes into the data archive and is available for others to interrogate data, to analyze the data, to answer additional questions. This gives you just a sense of, I think we did this analysis about 6 months ago. So far within the National Database of Autism Research, we have about 151,000 participants in the database. We have, you can see from these pie charts that more than half are boys. that the phenotypes are available for a large number of them. The phenotypes range from autism spectrum severely affected through control subjects, through Fragile X participants, etc. We have neuroimaging data. The pie chart on neuroimaging highlights the different types of data that we have available. Most of it's MRI. And the genomic pie chart sort of summarizes the kind of genomic data that are available. So lots of potential here. We also have a repository for genomics focused on the collection of biospecimens. It originally focused on genomics research. Now it's a little bit more broadly defined, also includes a stem cell center. NIH more broadly funds the Neuro Bio Bank. This was an initiative launched in 2013 to provide access to what is a rare resource, high-quality, well-characterized human post-mortem brain tissue. It's a collection of 6 partner sites. And just a couple years ago, NIMH Neuro Bio Bank actually joined the Autism Brain Net, to which CBER is a significant portion, to partner together and getting more autism brains, essentially. So this has been productive. The biobank is much broader than ASD, but it does have a fair number of autism brains available as well. And just a couple of other initiatives. These are not specific to autism, but we are currently in the process of funding the Lifespan Human Connectome project. We had been funding a Human Connectome project. This is a large-scale project and thousands of individuals to understand the normal connections in the human brain. We've expanded, that the original study was focused on adults. We've now extended that to understand the connections in the brain from early development, first in 5 to 21-year-olds, but now we've also added a baby connectome, so we'll have data from 0 to 5 as well. So this collects the normative data that I mentioned earlier was so important. If we really understand what goes awry during neurodevelopment and autism, we really need to understand foundationally what normal development actually looks like. And that's what these projects aim to accomplish. Skip that. And finally, I wanted to just tell you about the All of Us research program. I'm not sure how many of you know about this yet, but this is part of the Precision Medicine Initiative that came down from the executive branch of our government when President Obama was in office. It was launched in 2016. It is a large-scale project that focuses on collecting data, information from more than at least a million people, probably more than 1 million participants across the country. The All of Us program will enroll people through their HMOs, and eventually will enroll volunteers as well. They're not quite at that phase yet. But the idea is to collect health data from individuals and also link to their electronic health records so that we can do these big data approaches to understanding links between people's experiences, the treatments used for each of them, their prior histories, their family histories, linking all this data together to look for connections and links to give us a better idea of which people respond better to which kinds of treatments. So this is a massive, large-scale effort. And essentially, what we really hope people will do is participate in this, because it really requires a lot of people to participate. And I think one of our concerns at NIMH is that people with mental illness, mental health disorders are going to be less inclined to participate, but we hope that's not the case, and that we hope that we're going to be doing some outreach to try to encourage people to participate. Right now it's adults, but eventually they're going to include children as well, so this should be very interesting to this community. Interesting. And with that, I want to end here, and thank you for your time.